Hey there, this is Chess Coach Aaron. How you guys doing? And I'm here to show you a short game from one of my students. His name is Eisa, and shout out to Eisa, whoop whoop. And I love when my students send me games, and this is one of the spicy openings that I say beginners should kind of play to kind of get better at attacking. This is called the Greco Gambit, or some people call it the Greco Attack. And I want to talk about the Greco Gambit a little bit because this is an opening beginners should play. I do say there are many spicy starting kind of gambity openings: Danish Gambit, Scotch Gambit, Evans Gambit, Greco Gambit. I mean, it goes on and on, but these are good. You should pick one or two and use them to get better at attacking. In slower games against very strong players, they may not be the soundest openings all the time. But in general, we do a gambit to offer usually a pawn in opening, and we get something back for it. A center, more active pieces, possible attacks, etc., etc. Safer king. I mean, there's a lot of good reasons to offer a gambit. Greco Gambit is one of them. I've played it. I love it. All right, let's talk about the Greco Gambit and what it actually is. It's e4, e5. Knight of 3 attacking a pawn. They play the most common move, knight c6, to protect the pawn. You play bishop c4. This is actually 1, 2, 3 favorite moves to start a game for me. You can castle already, control the sweet center, the 4 squares in the middle of the board, as I like to call them, and Yasser Serouin also calls them. Controlling these 4 squares early in the game is really what I focus on a lot. And these first 3 moves, knight f3, e4, bishop c4, really do a great job of that. All right. Black usually has a couple of the main responses are bishop c5 and knight f6, bishop c5, and now white's got a lot of different ways to play against this. Here we're going to play c3, and it takes away from our knight, but we're making the small pawn move to support perhaps a larger pawn move, d4. Now we could go d4 right away even, and we could try other types of gambits or moves here. There's tons of good ones to choose from, but we're going to focus on c3 followed by d4. We want to take over that center. Now the most common move for black here is to develop this knight usually to f6. They think it's with a tempo, and it kind of technically is because it's attacking our e-pawn, and our e-pawn is not protected. So here's where the Greco attack or Greco Gambit comes into play. Now, started off on Italian, right? And these openings, the e4, e5 openings can change very quickly, the names of them. So don't try to memorize all the names. But the first 3 moves made it an Italian game. Now at this point, we're in a gioco piano. And white now has a choice. We played 4 moves for each side. There's 2 main ways to play here. You can play d4, which is Greco attack, and a gambit if you give up this pawn, if they accept this pawn, Greco Gambit. Or you can play very conservative, but is very strong, and that is just to protect your d-pawn, your e-pawn with the d-pawn. And this is a very strong starting structure. It's not fast though, it's slow, but it's very solid. So if you want to play spicy, go for d4, which I really love, and we're going to get into the Greco Gambit. If you want to play a little bit slower and much more solid, not so spicy, d3 is the way to go. But that's a different, this is the Gioco Pianissimo, and this is a whole different video series, which I'll do maybe at some point. But right now, we're going to go into Ace's game, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what occurred. But first, we want the basics of the Greco Gambit. So we want to take over the center with 2 pawns. We want that pawn duo or snowplow. We want to control the sweet center. And initially, we're challenging black to kind of stop us. And in order for them to stop us, to break up our center, our e4 and our d4 pawns, we're actually saying to them, you can take the e-pawn at one point, but then we'll have accelerated development. What do I mean? Well, right now we're attacking a bishop, and we have 2 attackers on their e-pawn. So black has to make a big decision here. They don't have time for castling. They have to deal with either the bishop being attacked, the 2 attackers on the e-pawn, or something along these lines, right? And I wouldn't recommend necessarily running away with the bishop now, right? This could actually get very bad for black very quickly. You're threatening checkmate and the piece. They can try to mess you up over here, but you can jump out of the way, and I would say go forward because you'd still be attacking this bishop, and you still have checkmate threats, and you're still attacking a knight. So there's a lot going on here, and this is all pretty good for white in the long run. Don't be alarmed if you lose castling because you're going to probably win at least a piece here. and have a great position. All right, so that is if they run away with that bishop in that particular position. Let's set it back up. But here, the most common move, and makes a lot of sense, is since the c-pawn has two attackers, you don't want to run back, right? You're blocking your d-pawn. You are protecting your e-pawn and saving the bishop, but you're blocking your d-pawn, and this is very unhappy pieces. Your light squared bishop and your queen are saying, what is going on? And again, this is a very strong position for white again. So that's not a great move. Most of the time, if you can't really deal with something like your e-pawn being attacked too much, you can trade away the headache. And here white takes back because, again, they want that strong center. Here's where black now can jump to the side. There's no c-pawn in the way and say check. And this tempo gaining move for black allows the idea of taking the undefended e-pawn, perhaps. And I'm not going to talk about Bishop d2 and go into depth with it, but this is the main line if you want to play solid still Greco attack, not Greco Gambit necessarily, because the pressure on this bishop, along with the queen, and this particular moment, does not really allow black to take the pawn. Instead, you will protect the pawn, but it does allow black to play d5. And if black plays d5 in most of these positions, usually black is okay. So if you're playing black and you're facing this, your real idea is to try to get in d5 safely, and usually that'll mean you are equal and you're safe. But that's not what we're playing. We're playing knight c3 instead, and that doesn't give quite the moment for them to play d5 safely. And we're going to castle, and the knight, even though it's pinned for the moment, once we castle, the knight will help. It's all about controlling d5 for a moment. We are actually offering a pawn, and it's going to take black time to capture this pawn. And notice, when the knight takes the e4 pawn, yes, the e4 pawn's not controlling d5, but the knight was on f6. It's not there now, and it was also controlling d5. So when it goes forward to capture, you're still technically controlling d5. And yes, white's down a pawn, but the king is not castled, so the idea would be then to castle. And here we have the main gist of the Greco Gambit. We have an open file for a rook, perhaps, or even queen on e2. And the king, their king, is still stuck on the center, still stuck on e8. And notice, once we castled, there's no longer a pin, so they don't have time to castle because we're making a threat. We're threatening that knight now. So everything from this point is with kind of a threat or a tempo. White's on a pawn, but white's ahead in development. Notice, they move this piece twice. That allows us to castle, so we have a rook available, and we have a safer king. But it's not for long. This particular idea in Gambit, why you're doing it, is something we call time. And we're not talking about like one free move or the word tempo. We're talking about time overall. Because if we look at this position, there's 1, 2, perhaps 3, perhaps 4 pieces for black which are not coming out right away to play. It's going to take time, especially for these 2 pieces, the queenside rook and bishop, to be useful. It's going to take a lot of time. So white has time to utilize for this pawn they've given up. Even though black has 3 pieces developed, white has 3 pieces developed, there's also piece happiness. And this bishop is super happy. This queen has great places also. It's super happy. The rook has a great place to go, super happy. So it's not just development. Maybe that's roughly equal, but it's the fact that white has a much happier army, many more choices. They have much easier time putting the pieces in strong places. They have what they call time, and that's really what is the argument here, the fighting argument between white and black in the Greco Gambit. I give you a pawn. What do I get for it? Well, you're going to get some time and a chance to build a position and attack and to play very spicy. I would always rather be an attacker than a defender. And for beginners, this is very important. Play spicy openings where you can attack, get better being an attacker, and it's actually easier to find good moves to get that king than it is to defend and stop the opponent. You make one mistake when you're defending, usually you get checkmated. You make one mistake when you're attacking, game is still on, usually. All right, so this is the gist of the beginning of the Greco Gambit. And now there's a couple ways for black, usually they're going to capture, because this is a threat. Their knight is hanging, and if they do anything else, well, rook's going to go to e1, Queen can go to b3, and notice on b3, this is a beautiful, beautiful battery. This is so strong. Plus, it puts pressure on the bishop also. So there's always a chance of attacking this knight, attacking the bishop. That's a possibility. This rook right here would pin stuff and be very active. Right now, black has to deal with this idea of what's a knight. And yes, black can play d5. And we talked a lot about when d5 might help black. It usually means to do good. But this knight's not pinned anymore. So the knight actually can take the pawn. And there are some ideas over here of capturing batteries. Even though white has an isolated pawn, white has still very good position. So black still needs to be careful here. Though, admittedly, if I had to really choose, I'd probably give back a pawn and hope that I stabilize my position versus letting white get these really good positions. All right, but that's with the d5, but not a lot of players d5. And really, once you have the pawn, you kind of want to keep it. Why take this pawn and then try to just give it back? It doesn't make a lot of sense when you think of it that way. All right, but let's go to Eisa's game. And one more time, shout out to Eisa. Whoop, whoop. Thank you for sending me this game. And let's go to the actual game he played. Boom. e4, e5, knight d3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, c3, and knight f6. Again, he played d4, but you can play d3 and go a lot slower, a lot safer if you didn't want to play these spicy lines. But d4, love it. Making lots of threats. And here, the most common way for black to take care of this headache is to just trade it away. But this gives white the strong center, this pawn duel in the center. Love it. So now, black will check here. That really is the best move. Save the bishop and do it with a tempo. And notice, if we back up here, let's say you save the bishop but you back up and you don't do the check, you're just giving white basically a free hand here. And you can tell, here's one of my favorite websites. And let's back it up. Actually, let me get my picture out of the way so you can see it better. And let's see where we are in this game. And that would be, I believe, right about here. And notice, let's open this up a little bit. Hold on one sec. Notice, you can see this better now. Notice these are the top moves in this database that have been played in this position. The top moves. Bishop e4 by far easily is the top move. And it makes sense. You're doing check and saving the bishop. Notice, though, if you play bishop b6, and this is the reason why I like this database. This is 365chess.com. I just love the look of the database with the green for white when they win, red for black when they win, and the gray for the draws. So you can see bishop b4, this is still fighting. It's almost 40% win percentage for white, and we got 34% for black. So white's doing pretty good compared to black, but black's not doing horrible, not by any means. But suddenly, let's say bishop b6, you look at the second most played move, and wow, almost closing on 60% win percentage for black. For white against black. And I will say this, when you look at these opening lines, when you see stuff that's 50% or greater winning for white, that's a good start for white, especially if it's 50% wins for white, 25% or less for black. 50% or more for white, 25% or less for black. You're talking about really strong opening for a certain color. Here we're talking about white getting a good attack. So what are some of the other choices? Bishop b6 here. Well, white has almost 60% win percentage. Knight takes d4. Something doesn't even seem like it's going to work. Well, that's easily white. But bishop e7, that is a real move to save the bishop. And that's 60% also, again. And all these other moves don't make any sense. All right, let's go back to the analysis board. And you can see what we're talking about. We check, and suddenly white's got to make a decision. Are we going to move our knight to d2 or c3, or block with the bishop to d2? And this is very common. This is a fork in the road, if you will. All right, let's take a quick look again at my favorite website, bishop b4 check. Let's move my picture out of the way over here. And now I wanted to show this one because there's spicier way to play and not a spicy way to play. They're both kind of spicy. You're already in the Greco Gambit area, the Greco attack. But you have your choice of bishop d2 and knight c3. Those are the main two choices. Bishop d2, right? Boom, bishop d2. And you can see that that's pretty straightforward. Bishops will get traded. And white has a little edge in that. Closing at 35% win, but black's got 31%. And notice bishop d2 and knight c3, roughly the same amount. It's almost 50-50. So bishop d2 is safer, but white has a nice little edge. Not a huge edge, though, but a nice little edge. But knight c3, boom, suddenly, if you take a look at this, knight c3 has a more spicy attitude, a spicier advantage for white. 46% for white. Now, black does have a higher win percentage too, and that's because the positions get really spicy and complicated. When you're playing spicy and complicated, things are happening. You got to stay focused. So black wins more also, but white really wins more. And you can see the little gray percentages of draws really get smaller because this starts to get really spicy. So this is 50-50, bishop d2, knight c3. But if you're going to play the true gambit and you're going to play spicy, let's play spicy, knight c3. And this is what Eisa played. Love it. And this offers the pawn on e4, which it's hard not to take if you're black, right? I mean, that pawn is a pawn, so you take the pawn, hold on to it maybe. But you do have to question the situation because white always gets good attacks. But if we look here, this center of white's is just monstrosity. This is just so strong. I mean, look at where these pawns could just go forward. Each one, e5 and d5, will go with tempos and attacks. We already have our bishop aiming at their f-pawn. Our knight can go towards the king, queen, bishop. After we castle, this other knight's ready to do stuff too. I mean, I just love drawing arrows. But this is just a great position for white. And black usually will take this pawn because simply it gets rid of one of these major headaches, major threats. And all we have to do now for white is castle, and suddenly it's on. Prove that you can hold this position, black. And black is saying, no way, prove that this is worth a pawn. All right. Now, knight takes on c3. They got to make a decision here. Their knight is being attacked, right? And d5 just gives the pawn back. They can take with the bishop, and actually I think taking with the bishop is a safer option because right now the E line is open, right? There's no pawns on it. This is an open line. Who can jump on this line first? Well, we have a rook for e1 for white and a queen to e2. So really white can take much more advantage of this than black can, at least right now. And that's important. When they capture with the knight, now there's nothing on the E line at all, nothing to even block it up. So the knight is not great here. It's not protected, but at least for a moment, it's blocking it up. So it takes a little bit more work for white. And again, we talk about d5 at the right time for black in these type of positions. When there's e4, e5 openings, d5 turns out to be critical. Not e4, e5 necessarily, but many times d5. Can white control it, or can black play it? And usually when black plays it, they're doing pretty good. Here we could back up, and we can aim for h7, or we can, and I think this one might be a little bit better, we can play b5, and we can play a little more positionally and try to mess them up. Because we do have knight to pile on the pin, we do have queen to pile on the pin, and we can mess up their pawns, so that's not too bad also. And white has a nice little game here, considering the situation, even though they are down a pawn. But putting the bishop back does make some sense. All right, but there are other ways to play this also. You can pin, you can try to do things over here. So there are other ways to also play it. That being said, again, bishop takes is probably a little safer and try to get in d5. But in this game, knight takes c3, and this gives white so many options. And notice, black still doesn't have time to castle because now you're attacking the bishop. And now they got to deal with the bishop. Is the bishop going to run away? And already white has fantastic possibilities, right? We have rook on e1, bishop g5, knight g5. This queen has b3, or the light squares along the king side. This bishop's aiming here. I mean, this is a rough position. And that's what we're talking about if the bishop runs away. And even when the bishop takes that pawn, attacking a rook, this is still a rough position. So there's a couple big choices here. And we got to end this video soon, but I want to run through these moves. There are a couple major choices here. This is the last big fork in the road we'll talk about. Queen b3, not protecting the rook, or bishop a3, protecting the rook and trying to make black sweat about castling. Because if this king stays in the center, that really justifies the sacrifice. All right, so notice right now the bishop does not help the king side. right? It's on the other side of this D pawn, so it can't help for defense. But it can take the rook. It can also later on run away, right? If at the right time, maybe run away. But something interesting is here, just I want to throw this out for defense, it's actually covering E1. So you make white work a little bit harder. When you take the A1 rook, which is hard to resist, you're actually letting this E line become all whites. Just absolutely not fighting at all. And this does happen a lot. All right, so bishop A3 and queen B3. These are the two main decisions here. Eisa went with queen B3, and this battery aiming at the F pawn, along with threatening that bishop, is just so strong. Again, we're going to utilize this open line, and we have lots of, bishop along the dark squares. We have a lot of possibilities here for white. All right, so his opponent did take this rook, and now Eisa played beautifully. Rook E1 check. King went over. Bishop took F7, threatening rook down, check, sure, why not? And notice over here, you actually have bishop being a very strong threat. Once this F pawn is gone, it can't go to F6 and block, and now bishop going to G5. Woof, this is really strong too. All they can do is throw the knight back, and it'll be pinned. This is already probably a winning position for white. All right, so knight E7, and again, I think bishop G5 right here is the best way to play it by itself because you're pinning that knight. You have two attackers. You can get the bishop perhaps in the right scenario. And once this bishop runs back, checkmate threats are going to also occur here. So this is just, again, I think a one position for white. What Eisa actually played, though, is fantastic also. Bishop A3. And the difference, though, is if you played bishop to G5, there's no F pawn to block. When you play bishop A3, they still have a pawn that can block. But after this block, which is basically forced, where did black's pawn really want to go? Their D pawn. We talk about it a lot. It actually still wants to go to D5 and kind of break up this battery if it can. Because the second this bishop runs back, there are checkmate threats on F7 that are just impossible to deal with, really. And this pawn on D6 doesn't break up this battery. So this does, bishop to A3 and then D6, this does something very positive for white. It makes it so their pawn can't go to D5. And if their pawn ever does go forward, then it unleashes the bishop. So this is still just basically a one position anyway. Let's see how Eisa finished it up. Bishop went back. They played G6. Makes sense. Probably real quick, the stronger move here is knight G5. Because when the bishop goes back to H5, you'll have the bishop covering E8, you have the queen covering G8, you have a knight helping with checkmate, and a bishop helping with checkmate, and there's actually nowhere for the king to go. So for one brief moment after G6, E8 was available for the queen to cover F7. Notice, if you're going to get your queen to F7 for checkmate, this queen can go to E8 and kind of cover it. Now, in order to get the queen to F7 for checkmate, though, you need a helper, and G6 blocked this bishop. It was the helper a moment ago, right? It was backing up, and now it's the helper to get checkmate. But G6 cuts off that bishop, so Eisa plays knight G5. Again, there's a helper for checkmate. And one of the good things about moving the knights in the Greco Gambit is that not only does the queen work along this diagonal, but it can swing over. This is a very important maneuver going to F3 sometimes. All right, but black, again, it's much easier to be an attacker than defender. And black plays king E8, and that's all there is to it. Check, 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 and checkmate. Fantastic job, Eisa. And to all the students I work with and beginners everywhere, try the Greco Gambit. Now, this is the first game. I'm going to do 3 of these videos. So I'm going to show 2 more Greco attacks, Greco Gambits also. I like to do these openings in series of 3, so you can kind of get an idea of different choices and forks in the road. But again, you're doing a gambit. Maybe give up a pawn early to get pressure, get something back for it. And in the Greco Gambit, you're either going to get the sweet center, that pawn duo, or they're going to take the pawn and you're going to get activity and some time, a lot of time. Because notice, at the end of this game, if we look at their rook and their bishop on the queen side alone, they were never part of this game, never. Even this rook over here, the king side rook, was never part of the game either. So they never came out to play or help defend the king. Didn't happen. All right, let's get one quick joke in and the video will be done. What is a witch's favorite subject at school? Now, all you guys that I work with, all you guys are school students, so you should know. You probably went to school with some witches, right? And you should know then, what is a witch's favorite subject in school? Well, this is easy. I'm going to have to say spelling. All right. This is Chess Coach Aaron out. Use the Greco Gambit. Peace.